For most of human history, a full day did not mean being busy. It meant being alive. No schedules, no urgency, no constant sense of falling behind. Early humans worked less than we do, rested more, shared food, watched the sky, made things by hand, and let time move at the speed of the sun. Tonight, we're not chasing survival myths. We're slowing down to see what a human day once truly was. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. So tonight, let's do something unusual. Let's turn the clock backward, not to a famous date or a dramatic event, but to a way of living that existed long before schedules ever did. Before alarms, deadlines, and the quiet anxiety of being late. Let's step into a world where time was felt, not measured, and where a day began simply because light returned to the sky. A world without schedules does not announce itself with silence. It arrives quietly, the way dawn always has, without alarms, without urgency, without the sharp insistence that something is already late. Consciousness returns slowly, not because the day demands it, but because light has changed its angle and bodies nearby have shifted. For most of human history, this was how mornings worked. Not as a starting gun, but as a soft invitation. There is no clock waiting to accuse you, no list of tasks forming in your head before your eyes have fully opened, no concept of productivity hovering over the day like a moral requirement. Instead, there is temperature. There's the sensation of stiffness easing out of joints that slept close to the ground. There is breath, steady and unremarkable. There are other people nearby, familiar voices, familiar movements, not demanding anything, simply existing in the same space. In this world, nobody wakes up already behind. That idea alone is difficult for a modern mind to absorb. We are trained to think of time as something that can be wasted, lost, or stolen. But for early humans, time was not a resource to manage. It was a condition, like weather. You did not use the morning. You experienced it. And you did not rush through it, because rushing only burned calories you would need later. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies give us a surprisingly consistent picture here. Mornings were slow not because people were lazy, but because efficiency mattered. A body that moves too fast too early pays for it by midday. So people eased into wakefulness, stretching, shifting, warming themselves near embers that had been kept alive through the night. Someone was always awake enough to tend the fire, not because it was heroic, but because letting it die would create unnecessary work later. Children woke first, as they often do. Energy unspent, curiosity already active. They moved closer to the warmth, not to start tasks, but to start being. Adults followed more gradually. There was no rush to get going, because nothing was waiting to punish delay. Hunger would arrive when it arrived. Weather would unfold, whether or not anyone was prepared. The day was not something to conquer. It was something to move through. This is where the first quiet question begins to form, even if no one would have spoken it aloud. How much does a good day actually require? Not in achievements, not in outcomes, but in actions. How many things must be done before a day can be called complete? For early humans, the answer was surprisingly small. There were necessities, of course. Food had to be found. Tools needed attention. Children required care. Fire demanded maintenance. But none of these tasks came with deadlines, and none of them needed to be finished before an imaginary hour passed. They expanded or contracted depending on energy, conditions, and mood. Work was embedded into life, not separated from it. And here is where the humor sneaks in, quietly. In a world without productivity, there was also no burnout. No one felt guilty for sitting still. No one measured their worth by how exhausted they felt at the end of the day. Rest was not something you earned. It was something you did when your body suggested it. Modern research supports this rhythm. Studies of foraging societies consistently show that adults spend only 4 to 6 hours a day on what we would classify as work. The rest of the time is unstructured, not empty but open, filled with conversation, observation, play, minor repairs, storytelling, and long stretches of doing nothing in particular. If that sounds inefficient, it is worth remembering that this pattern sustained our species for tens of thousands of years. In the absence of schedules, attention shifts outward. People notice light, wind, sounds. They read subtle changes in temperature and bird behavior. This awareness is not mystical. It is practical. A mind that is not constantly pulled forward by appointments becomes better at noticing what is happening now. And noticing, in a world without safety nets, was one of the most valuable skills a human could have. Nobody was busy, but everyone was engaged. And that may be the most unfamiliar part for us. Engagement without urgency. Purpose without pressure. A day that does not demand proof of value. The morning does not ask you what you plan to accomplish. It simply offers itself. So as we step further into this world, we are not chasing dramatic hunts or heroic survival stories. We are slowing down enough to see the structure beneath the calm. Because once you remove schedules, something else becomes visible. The way humans organize time when they are not afraid of it. The way a day unfolds when it is allowed to be human. And that raises a question worth carrying forward. Not just about the past, but about us. If a good human day once required so little rushing, so little urgency, so little proof, what exactly did we add when we decided we needed more? Now that we've stepped out of modern time, the first thing we notice is not what people did, but how gently the day began. Before work, before hunger, before plans, there was the simple act of becoming awake. Not suddenly, not on command, but slowly, the way a body remembers itself. This is where a human day truly started, long before waking up became something you had to do. For early humans, waking up was not an event. It was not something that happened all at once. There was no sharp border between sleeping and being awake, no instant when the day suddenly demanded attention. Consciousness did not snap on. It drifted back in, slowly, the way warmth returns to fingers after cold. This matters more than it sounds. In the modern world, waking up is often treated like a command, a signal, a small emergency that must be answered immediately. An alarm goes off, and suddenly you are expected to be a functioning member of society within seconds. Eyes open, mind racing, obligations already waiting. But for most of human history, the body did not experience mornings this way. The body was allowed to negotiate its return. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies give us a remarkably consistent picture. Sleep was lighter, more flexible, and often broken into segments. What modern sleep science calls polyphasic or segmented sleep appears to have been common. People slept for a few hours, woke for a time, then slept again. This was not insomnia. It was normal. During the night, someone was usually awake. Not because they were anxious and not because they were heroic, but because sleep itself moved in waves. Older adults slept more lightly. Some people woke naturally when the fire needed attention. Others stirred when children shifted or whimpered. In small groups living close together, total unconsciousness was rare. Awareness was shared. This meant that morning did not arrive as a shock. When the sky began to change color, when darkness softened into gray, people were already partially present. The transition had begun hours earlier. The body had been adjusting slowly, quietly, without drama. So when eyes finally opened fully, there was no sense of being yanked out of sleep. Just a continuation. And importantly, there was no expectation attached to that moment. No one woke up thinking, "What do I need to achieve today?" There was no social pressure to immediately produce value, no invisible audience waiting to judge how quickly you became useful. Morning was not for action, it was for orientation. The first thing the body noticed was not purpose, but sensation. Temperature, the coolness of air on skin, the firmness of the ground beneath layers of grass or hide, the presence of other bodies nearby close enough to share warmth. Smell came next, faint smoke, earth, old fire, the accumulated scent of human life. None of it alarming, none of it demanding response. This slow sensory re-entry mattered physiologically. Without artificial light, human circadian rhythms followed the sun closely. Melatonin faded gradually as light increased. Cortisol rose gently, not in a spike, but in a curve. The body prepared itself over time. Modern sleep research shows that abrupt awakenings increase stress hormones and cognitive fog. Early humans avoided this simply by never inventing alarms. Children often woke first, not because they were disciplined, but because they had energy to burn and curiosity to satisfy. They moved, stretched, crawled closer to warmth. Adults noticed, but not urgently. There was no need to immediately manage the day. Children were allowed to exist before being directed. Adults followed in their own time. Some sat up slowly. Some stayed lying down, eyes open but unfocused, letting stiffness ease out of muscles. Stretching was instinctive. No one called it exercise, it was maintenance, the body checking itself before the day unfolded. And here is where the humor slips in, quietly and without trying too hard. No one woke up and immediately had to do something for society. There was no inbox to clear, no role to perform at 7 a.m., no need to prove productivity before breakfast. The morning did not test you. It did not measure you. It simply allowed you to arrive. This absence of urgency was not laziness. It was strategy. In a world where calories mattered, rushing was expensive. Sudden movements burned energy that might be needed later. Early humans learned, over thousands of generations, that efficiency was not speed. Efficiency was timing. You did not move until movement was useful. So the morning became a buffer zone, a space between sleep and labor where the body could align itself, where joints could loosen, where hunger could announce itself naturally instead of being overridden by schedules, where attention could widen instead of narrowing immediately onto tasks. Anthropologists observing modern foraging societies have repeatedly noted how little happens early in the morning by modern standards. People talk, they sit, they observe the weather, they check the fire, they check on one another. Plans, if they form at all, form slowly. This is not indecision. It is calibration. What is the weather doing? How does the body feel today? Who is present? Who looks tired? Who looks injured? Who might need to stay close to camp? These questions matter more than abstract plans, and they can only be answered if you give the morning time to exist. There was also a social function here. Waking together reinforced group cohesion. People reassembled after the vulnerability of sleep. Everyone accounted for, everyone visible. This mattered deeply in small groups where survival depended on cooperation. Morning was a quiet roll call, conducted without words. Everyone made it through the night. That alone was enough to justify a slow start. And because mornings were not crowded with obligations, they became moments of subtle communication. A glance, a comment, a shared observation about the sky or the temperature. These exchanges were not idle. They were how information moved through the group. In the modern world, we often delay awareness until after coffee. Early humans did the opposite. Awareness came first. Action followed later. There is evidence that this pattern shaped cognition itself. Without constant external demands, attention could remain broad. People noticed small changes, a shift in wind direction, the absence of a familiar bird call, the smell of rain. These signals were meaningful. And noticing them required a mind that was not already overwhelmed. This is one reason why mornings were not filled with work. Not because there was nothing to do, but because doing too soon blinded you to what you needed to see. And perhaps most striking of all, there was no emotional narrative attached to waking up. Morning was not framed as a battle. It was not something to conquer. No one talked about being not a morning person. There was no identity wrapped around alertness. You woke when you woke. The group adjusted. This flexibility protected people. Those who slept poorly were not punished by rigid schedules. Those who woke earlier simply tended to light tasks. There was no expectation of uniform performance. The day was built around human variability, not the other way around. And this leads to a quiet but important conclusion. For early humans, the purpose of morning was not success. It was survival in the simplest, most literal sense. Staying warm, staying connected, staying oriented. The day would bring effort soon enough, but effort worked best when the body was ready for it. So the morning remained a soft edge. A place where nothing impressive happened, where no stories were made, where history did not announce itself. Just people becoming awake together slowly, under a sky that did not care what time it was. And if that feels unfamiliar or even uncomfortable, that discomfort might be telling us something. Not about them, but about us. About how far we have pushed the act of waking away from its original purpose. Because once upon a time, morning was not for achievement, it was for arriving. And only after that, when the body had settled into itself and the world had been read properly, did the day begin to ask for anything at all. Once bodies had fully arrived in the day and the morning had done its quiet work of waking people gently, another question began to surface, not about purpose or ambition, but about effort. After becoming awake, after orienting to light and air and one another, how much work actually followed? Not in theory, but in practice. Not in myth, but in the rhythm of an ordinary human day. For a long time, the dominant story about early humans was simple and dramatic. Life before agriculture was imagined as an endless struggle, a daily race against hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Wake up, hunt, gather, barely survive, repeat. A kind of permanent emergency stretched across thousands of years. It's a powerful image and it appears everywhere, from textbooks to films. It is also, according to the evidence, deeply misleading. When anthropologists began spending long periods living with modern hunter-gatherer societies and carefully documenting how people actually use their time, the results were surprising enough to feel almost uncomfortable. Across different environments and continents, a consistent pattern appeared. Adults typically spent between 4 and 6 hours a day on what we would call subsistence work, finding food, preparing it, maintaining tools, tending fires, repairing shelters. That was it. Not 12 hours, not from dawn until collapse. 4 to 6. This wasn't because people lacked ambition or discipline. It was because they didn't need more. Their methods were efficient, their knowledge deep, and their expectations realistic. They worked enough to meet needs, not to outrun them. And just as important as the number of hours is how those hours were structured. Work was not compressed. There was no sense of needing to get everything done as quickly as possible. Tasks expanded and contracted naturally, shaped by energy levels, weather, and opportunity. If gathering took longer one day, it simply took longer. If a hunt failed, no one tried to make up for lost productivity the next morning. The day adjusted itself. This is a fundamentally different relationship to labor. In modern life, work is often defined by the clock rather than the body. You are expected to maintain a certain pace regardless of fatigue, hunger, or physical condition. Early humans did the opposite. They organized work around bodily signals. When energy was high, effort followed. When it dropped, activity softened. Anthropologists have noted that foraging societies often show no sharp distinction between work and non-work. Tasks are woven into social life. Someone repairs a tool while talking. Someone gathers food while teaching a child. Someone processes meat while laughing at a story. These are not interruptions. They are the work itself. And this is where the myth really begins to unravel. Early humans were not spending every waking moment desperately searching for food. In many environments, food was abundant if you knew where to look. Knowledge mattered more than speed. A skilled gatherer could collect enough food for an entire group in a relatively short amount of time because the landscape was not random to them. It was mapped in memory. Plants grow where they grew last year. Animals follow patterns. Water collects in familiar places. This predictability reduced labor dramatically. You didn't need to search everywhere. You needed to go to the right places at the right times. As a result, work became episodic rather than continuous. There might be a few hours of focused effort, followed by long stretches of lighter activity. Gathering in the morning, tool maintenance in the afternoon, socializing, resting, watching children, then perhaps another short burst of work before evening. This rhythm mattered. Human bodies are well suited to intermittent effort, short periods of exertion followed by recovery. What they are not well suited to is constant low-level strain without rest. Modern burnout is, in many ways, a mismatch between ancient bodies and modern schedules. Early humans avoided this mismatch by accident, simply by never inventing it. And here we can allow a small smile. They had no idea what hustle culture was, and they somehow managed to survive as a species. There was no prestige attached to exhaustion. Being tired was not a badge of honor. It was information. It told you something about your body and that information was respected. This doesn't mean life was easy. It means difficulty came in waves, not as a constant background hum. There were days of intense effort, long hunts, heavy loads, harsh weather. But those days stood out precisely because they were not the norm. Most days were moderate, and when work was done, it stopped. There was no concept of just a little more, no squeezing productivity into every remaining moment of daylight. Once enough food was gathered, enough tools were functional, enough wood was collected, there was no reason to keep going. Extra effort did not create extra safety, it only created fatigue. This principle shows up again and again in ethnographic records. Foraging societies rarely accumulate surplus beyond what is useful. Carrying extra goods makes movement harder. Storing excess creates risk. Sharing spreads security more effectively than hoarding, so labor was calibrated carefully. Enough, but not too much. This calibration extended to social expectations as well. No one person was expected to work constantly. Labor was distributed, flexible, and responsive. If someone was injured or tired, others adjusted. Productivity was collective, not individual. There was no weekly performance review. And because work was not tied to identity in the modern sense, failure carried less psychological weight. A failed hunt was disappointing, but it was not personal. It was part of the system. Someone else would gather food. Another opportunity would come. The group absorbed the loss. This resilience was built into the structure of labor itself. The absence of compressed work had another important effect. It preserved attention. Without the pressure to rush, people could remain observant. A gatherer noticing a new plant growth, a hunter tracking subtle changes in animal movement, a toolmaker sensing a flaw in stone before it became a problem. These observations prevented future labor. They reduced risk. In this way, working slowly was not inefficient. It was preventative. Modern studies of hunter-gatherers consistently emphasize this point. Time spent resting, watching, talking, or doing nothing is not wasted. It is part of the work. It maintains the system that allows work to be effective when it is needed. This challenges a deeply ingrained modern belief. That value comes from visible effort, that if you are not actively doing something measurable, you are falling behind. Early humans did not share this belief. Their days were shaped by sufficiency, not maximization. They did not ask how much they could extract from a day. They asked how little they needed to do to make the day sustainable. And that question changes everything. It means that work was never meant to fill time. Time existed first. Work occupied a portion of it, not the other way around. As daylight moved on, labor faded naturally. People did not push through fatigue, they responded to it. Evening arrived not as a deadline, but as a cue. Activity softened, attention shifted inward. By the time the sun lowered, most necessary work was already finished. And this is perhaps the most radical difference of all. Early humans did not carry work mentally when they stopped doing it physically. There was no planning spiral, no replaying tasks, no anxiety about tomorrow's to-do list. Work ended when it ended. The mind was free to do something else. So when we ask how much they actually worked, the answer is not just numerical, it is structural. They worked fewer hours, yes, but more importantly, they worked differently. They allowed effort to be bounded. They trusted the landscape. They trusted shared labor. They trusted that doing enough was, in fact, enough. And that trust gave them something modern life often withholds: time that belonged to them. Not time for productivity, time for recovery, time for presence, time for simply being awake in a world that did not require constant explanation. As we move forward, this rhythm becomes even clearer, because once work stopped defining the day, other things were allowed to emerge: craft, play, conversation, observation. The quiet social glue that held small human groups together long before anyone tried to optimize them. But before we go there, it's worth sitting with this idea just a moment longer. A human life sustained itself for tens of thousands of years without constant busyness, not by working harder, but by knowing when to stop. Once work stopped being a constant pressure and effort found its natural limits, another assumption quietly fell apart. If early humans were not working all day, they were not starving all day either. To understand how that balance was possible, we need to look at the most misunderstood part of prehistoric life. Not the hunt, not the danger, but the simple, everyday reality of food. If there is one modern anxiety that would have puzzled early humans, it is the fear of missing a meal. Not hunger itself. Hunger was familiar, but panic about food, the background tension that whispers, what if this isn't enough? What if I choose wrong? What if I fall behind? That kind of worry belongs to a very different world. For most of human history, food was not scarce in the way we imagine it. It was everywhere. And because it was everywhere, panic was not. This is where another powerful myth quietly dissolves. We often picture early humans waking each morning with an urgent question: will we eat today? The image is dramatic but misleading. Archaeological evidence, combined with ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer societies, paints a much calmer picture. Food was not guaranteed, but it was predictable, and predictability changes psychology. The foundation of the human diet was not hunting, it was gathering. Roots, tubers, nuts, seeds, berries, leaves, flowers, insects, shellfish, small animals, fish. A long, flexible list that shifted with seasons and landscapes. Hunting provided concentrated calories when it succeeded, but gathering provided reliability. Day after day, it filled stomachs without drama. This is not speculation. It is written into teeth. When archaeologists examine dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, they find microscopic traces of what people ate: starch grains from wild plants, phytoliths from grasses and seeds, residues from roots and tubers. Evidence that early humans consumed a wide range of plant foods, often far more diverse than modern diets. The same story appears in coprolites, fossilized feces. As unglamorous as that sounds, they are some of the most direct dietary records we have. Coprolites from Paleolithic sites contain fragments of dozens of plant species, insect remains, pollen, and fibers. This is not the signature of desperation. It is the signature of abundance, filtered through knowledge. Early humans were not eating everything because they were starving. They were eating everything because they could. They were dietary generalists. That flexibility was one of our species' greatest strengths. A group that relied on a single food source was fragile. A group that could eat 50 different things always had options. And crucially, they did not eat on schedules. There was no breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There were no meal times enforced by clocks or social rules. People ate when food was available and when hunger appeared. Sometimes that meant small amounts throughout the day. Sometimes it meant a larger communal meal in the evening. The body led, the calendar did not. This mattered physiologically. Without rigid meal times, blood sugar rose and fell naturally. Hunger was information, not an inconvenience to be suppressed. Eating was responsive, not pre-planned. Modern research into metabolic flexibility suggests that this pattern, eating variably rather than constantly, aligns closely with how human bodies evolved to function. And psychologically, it mattered even more. When food is predictable but not scheduled, it stops dominating attention. You notice hunger, you address it, and then you move on. There is no countdown to the next meal, no obsession with timing, no moral language attached to eating. There was no menu, but there was also no dieting. No one stood around wondering if today's food choice was optimal. No one tracked calories. No one labeled foods as guilty or virtuous. Food was evaluated by simple criteria. Is it edible? Is it safe? Is it available? Does it provide energy? If the answer was yes, it was food. This does not mean early humans ate carelessly. Quite the opposite. Their knowledge of plants was extraordinarily precise. Ethnographic studies of modern foraging societies show that individuals often know 200 to 300 plant species in detail. Which parts are edible, which require processing, which are medicinal, which are toxic, which look similar but will make you sick if you confuse them. This knowledge was not abstract. It was embodied. Children learned it by watching, by walking alongside older gatherers, by hearing stories tied to specific plants. This one feeds you. This one heals you. This one looks similar, but it will make your stomach turn inside out. Knowledge was attached to memory, location, and consequence. Mistakes were costly, so attention was sharp. This deep botanical literacy meant that landscapes were not empty spaces waiting to be exploited. They were libraries. Every hill, riverbank, grove, and marsh held information. When food was needed, people did not wander aimlessly. They went to known places at known times for known resources. That is why gathering could be efficient. In many environments, a skilled gatherer could collect enough food for an entire group in just a few hours. Sometimes less. The work was steady, not frantic. Walking, digging, picking, carrying. Effort, yes. Panic, no. And if meat was not available that day, it was not a crisis. This is where modern projections often distort the past. We assume that meat absence equals starvation. But for most early humans, meat absence simply meant a different meal. Roots instead of muscle. Nuts instead of marrow. Fish instead of large game. The nutritional diversity of gathered foods covered most daily needs. So no one wrote a sad status update when there was no meat today. In fact, many days probably passed without any meat at all, and that was fine. Hunting was risky, animals were dangerous, hunts failed often, but gathering almost always succeeded. That reliability shaped attitudes. Food was not something you chased constantly. It was something you interacted with. There was also an important social dimension here. Food was rarely eaten alone. Sharing was the norm, not the exception. This was not generosity as moral virtue. It was risk management. A person who shared food today could expect food tomorrow, when circumstances reversed. Anthropologists describe this as demand sharing. Food moved through social networks fluidly. Hoarding was discouraged, not by law, but by reputation. Someone who consistently refused to share found themselves isolated when they needed help. This system reduced anxiety. You were not solely responsible for feeding yourself. You were part of a group that absorbed fluctuations together. Hunger was a collective problem, not a personal failure. And because food moved socially, it carried information with it. Who gathered what? Where it was found? What was ripe? What was scarce? Meals were conversations, lessons, planning sessions disguised as eating. There was no sense of wasting food in the modern sense because food was understood as temporary. Excess was shared. Surplus was used to reinforce relationships rather than stored indefinitely. Carrying too much made movement harder. Sharing made survival easier. From a modern perspective, this can look inefficient. From an evolutionary perspective, it is elegant. The absence of panic around food also shaped daily rhythm. Without the need to secure every calorie immediately, people could afford to pace themselves. Gathering trips could be social. Children could come along. Teaching could happen in real time. This slowed learning but deepened it. And because food was embedded in daily life rather than isolated into meals, eating itself became less dramatic. There was pleasure, certainly, sweetness, richness, texture, but there was no spectacle, no indulgence narrative, just nourishment. Early humans were not obsessed with food, they were fluent in it. That fluency is visible in the archaeological record. Burn marks on roots indicating controlled roasting. Grinding stones worn smooth by repeated seed processing, evidence of soaking, drying, fermenting, techniques that increase digestibility and safety. These are not signs of desperation. They are signs of refinement. And refinement changes how you feel about scarcity. When you know 10 ways to make food from your environment, the absence of one option does not feel like loss. It feels like substitution. This adaptability extended across environments. Coastal groups relied heavily on shellfish, fish, and sea plants. Forest groups focused on nuts, game, and berries. Riverine groups combined aquatic and terrestrial foods. Each group's knowledge was tuned to place, but the principle was the same: diversity equals security. So when we say food was everywhere, we do not mean it was effortless. We mean it was integrated. It belonged to the landscape, not to markets, to seasons, not to schedules. And when food belongs to the world rather than to systems, fear behaves differently. There is hunger, but not obsession. There is effort, but not desperation. There is planning, but not anxiety. This does not romanticize the past. There were lean seasons, droughts, failed harvests of wild plants, periods of stress. But even then, responses were collective and adaptive. Move camp, change diet, expand networks, adjust expectations. What did not dominate was the constant, low-grade panic many modern people feel about eating the wrong thing, at the wrong time, in the wrong amount. That panic is cultural, not biological. Early humans did not spend their days thinking about food. They thought with food, through it, around it, as part of the fabric of daily life. Which is why, after a few hours of gathering or processing, attention naturally shifted elsewhere. Tools, children, conversation, rest, observation. Food did not end the day. It supported it. And this calm relationship with nourishment allowed something else to flourish. When eating does not consume the mind has space for other things: making, teaching, playing, watching the sky, sitting quietly with no reason at all. So as we move forward, it is worth carrying this image with us, not of starving figures scrambling for survival, but of people moving through landscapes they understood deeply, eating from environments they trusted, and living in bodies that were not constantly braced for loss. Food was everywhere. And because of that, fear rarely had a reason to be. Once food no longer felt like an emergency and daily needs were quietly met, attention shifted to something that did not happen every day, but was always being considered. Hunting was not a constant action, but a constant thought. It lived in observation, in memory, and in quiet conversations long before anyone ever picked up a spear. If there is one image that has dominated our imagination of early human life, it is the hunt. Spears raised, bodies tense, danger everywhere, survival hanging on a single throw. It is dramatic, cinematic, and deeply misleading. Because while hunting mattered, it was not what filled most days. What filled the days was something quieter, slower, and far more reliable: planning. Hunting was rare. Thinking about hunting was constant. This distinction changes everything. After food gathering had taken care of daily needs and panic had been removed from the equation, hunting occupied a very different psychological space. It was not the default activity. It was not something people rushed into each morning. It was an option weighed carefully against energy, risk, weather, and opportunity. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence agrees on this point. Successful hunts did not happen every day. In many environments, they might occur once every few days, sometimes once a week, sometimes even less. Between those events were long stretches of preparation, observation, discussion, and patience. This was not inactivity. It was strategy. Animals are unpredictable. They move, they sense danger, they fight back. Early humans learned quickly that charging after game without information was a waste of energy and often life. So they did not hunt impulsively. They hunted deliberately. Most days, no one picked up a spear at all. Instead, people watched. They noticed tracks. They paid attention to wind direction. They remembered where herds had passed weeks earlier. They shared small observations around the fire. I saw fresh prints near the river. The antelope moved north earlier this season. The ground is too dry today. None of this led immediately to action. It accumulated. Planning was continuous, but action was selective. This is why hunting became a group event rather than an individual one. A hunt required coordination. It required enough healthy adults. It required tools in good condition. It required time, and it required consensus. No one simply decided on their own that today was hunting day and expected everyone else to follow. When a hunt did happen, it was because multiple signals had aligned. The weather was right. The animals were where they were expected to be. Enough people were rested. Enough food had already been gathered to absorb the risk if the hunt failed. Only then did the group commit. This commitment mattered because hunting was expensive. Not in money, but in calories and danger. Large animals could injure or kill. A broken leg or deep wound was often fatal in a world without antibiotics or surgery. Even a successful hunt carried risks during butchering and transport. So, early humans were cautious. Courage was not recklessness. It was judgment. This judgment shaped the techniques they used. One of the most distinctive methods associated with early humans is persistence hunting. It sounds dramatic, but in practice it was methodical rather than heroic. Humans are not fast sprinters. Almost any large prey can outrun us in short bursts. What humans can do is move steadily for long periods, especially in heat. Thanks to sweating and upright posture, humans dissipate heat efficiently. Many animals cannot. They overheat. They must stop. Humans learned to exploit this difference not by chasing wildly, but by maintaining pressure. A persistence hunt was not a sprint. It was a long walk, punctuated by short jogs, tracking, reacquiring, tracking again, sometimes for hours, often under the sun. The goal was not speed, but endurance. And even this technique was used selectively. It required terrain that allowed tracking. It required temperatures that favored human cooling. It required multiple people rotating effort. One person could not do it alone. Cooperation was essential. Which brings us to another important correction. Hunting was never a solo act. Popular images of lone hunters stalking prey are largely fiction. Archaeological evidence shows coordinated movement, shared tool styles, and communal processing. Hunting success depended on communication and trust. Who would take which position? Who would drive the animal? Who would wait? Who would track if the trail was lost? This coordination required planning long before the hunt began. And this planning happened constantly, even when no hunt was imminent. Children learned tracking by watching adults read the ground. Adolescents practiced endurance by walking long distances during gathering trips. Tool makers refined spear points and hafting methods in advance. Knowledge circulated continuously. So when the moment arrived, the group was ready. Still, most hunts failed. This is the part that rarely makes it into stories. Animals escaped, trails disappeared, weather changed, someone twisted an ankle, the herd shifted direction unexpectedly. Failure was common enough that it carried little stigma. No one treated an unsuccessful hunt as a personal catastrophe. There was no sense of wasted time. Planning itself had value. Every failed hunt produced information about animal behavior, about terrain, about timing. That information fed into future decisions. Nothing was truly lost. And here is where we can allow a small, gentle laugh. Many hunts ended not with triumph, but with a long walk home. No one made speeches about resilience. No one reframed failure as a learning opportunity in motivational language. People simply returned, a little tired, a little dusty, and resumed gathering, repairing, eating, and resting. The group absorbed the outcome. This emotional flexibility was crucial. It prevented despair, it prevented blame, and it reinforced cooperation. Hunting was a shared risk. Success was shared. Failure was shared. No individual carried the weight alone. Because of this, hunting never became the sole pillar of survival. It was one strategy among many. This is why early humans could afford to be patient. They did not need every hunt to succeed. They needed enough success over time, and that required restraint, not overhunting, not chasing animals when conditions were poor, not exhausting the group. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies often note how rarely people appear frantic. Even when planning a hunt, the tone is measured. Discussion, agreement, adjustment. The urgency is practical, not emotional. This contrasts sharply with modern narratives of survival. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as a constant emergency, but emergencies lose their meaning when everything is an emergency. Early humans understood this intuitively. They preserved urgency for moments that truly required it, which meant that when a hunt did succeed, it mattered. A successful hunt produced a large amount of food, more than could be eaten immediately. This triggered a different set of activities: butchering, sharing, preservation, transport, social coordination. And again, planning mattered. How to divide the meat, who carried what, how much to eat now versus later. These decisions reinforced social bonds and reputations. Generosity was noticed, selfishness was remembered, but even here, hunting did not dominate identity. A good hunter was respected, but not above others. A skilled gatherer who fed the group daily carried just as much weight. The system worked because no single role was allowed to become indispensable. This balance prevented hierarchy from solidifying too early. Hunting required cooperation. Cooperation required equality. Planning required listening. Listening required humility. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. Groups that allowed individual ego to override collective judgment would take unnecessary risks. Groups that planned together survived longer. And planning was not abstract. It was embedded in movement, in walking the same paths season after season, in watching the same valleys fill and empty, in remembering where water remained during dry periods, in recognizing patterns. This pattern recognition is one of the defining traits of human cognition. And hunting, more than raw strength, exercised it constantly. Even when no hunt occurred, the mental rehearsal continued. This is why hunting was rare, but planning was constant. The hunt itself was a punctuation mark. The sentence was everything around it. And when we remove the drama and focus on the structure, a different picture emerges. Not of desperate figures chasing survival, but of thoughtful groups making careful decisions in uncertain environments. They were not gamblers. They were risk managers. They balanced effort against reward, danger against necessity, action against patience, and they did so collectively, without formal leadership, without written rules, without central authority, which is no small achievement. As we move forward, this pattern becomes even clearer, because once hunting was placed in its proper context, as an occasional but important event rather than a daily obsession, something else takes center stage. The things people did between hunts, making tools, teaching children, repairing, resting, talking, observing, playing. Hunting mattered, but it did not own the day. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Early humans survived not because they were always doing the most dramatic thing available, but because they knew when not to. They knew that patience was a form of intelligence, and that sometimes the smartest move was to wait, to watch, and to walk home empty-handed, confident that the world would still offer food tomorrow. Once the planning had been done and the hunt, whether successful or not, had passed into memory, most of the day returned to something far quieter, not chasing animals, not searching the landscape, but sitting down and shaping the world by hand. This is where time slowed again, and where the ordinary work of making things quietly held everything together. If hunting was the story people loved to tell, and gathering was the work that quietly kept everyone alive, then making things was the center that held the entire day together. Not the dramatic center, the quiet one. After the planning, after the watching, after the decisions about whether today would involve a hunt or not, Most days settled into something far less cinematic but far more constant. Hands picked up stone. Fingers worked hide. Bone was shaped slowly, patiently. The real rhythm of prehistoric life lived here in the long hours of making and maintaining the material world. This was not a side activity. It was the backbone. Archaeology makes this clear, in a way stories often do not. When researchers excavate Paleolithic sites, they rarely find evidence of nonstop hunting. What they find instead are layers upon layers of debris from making things. Stone flakes scattered across the ground, broken tools replaced by new ones, scrapers worn smooth from hide processing, awls polished by repeated use. The ground itself remembers this work. Stone tools alone tell an enormous story. Lithic technology was not casual. It was not a matter of banging rocks together until something sharp appeared. By the Upper Paleolithic, humans were practicing highly refined techniques that required years of learning. Core preparation, platform angles, controlled fracture patterns. These were not accidents. They were the result of accumulated knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. And this work took time. Making a good stone blade was not something you rushed. Rushing ruined stone. One wrong strike and hours of careful preparation vanished. So tool making demanded attention, patience, and calm. The body leaned into the task. Hands moved rhythmically. The sound of stone on stone became a familiar background noise of the day. This was work, but not hurried work. Use-wear analysis confirms just how central this activity was. When archaeologists examine microscopic wear patterns on tools, they see repeated specialized use. Certain tools were clearly made for scraping hide, others for cutting meat, others for working wood. These tools were not interchangeable. They were designed with intention. That intention points to something important. Specialization existed much earlier than we once assumed. Not everyone was equally good at everything. Some people were clearly better tool makers. Others excelled at hide processing. Others at working bone or antler. These differences mattered, and groups noticed them. Over time, individuals leaned into their strengths. This did not create rigid job titles, but it did create reputation. If you were good at making blades that lasted longer or cut cleaner, people preferred your tools. If your scraper didn't tear hides, people remembered. If your work failed, they remembered that too. Skill became social knowledge. And here the humor slips in quietly. A bad tool might still work. But no one wanted to be remembered as the person who made bad tools. Reputation mattered in small groups, not in a competitive resume-building sense, but in a practical one. When survival depended on tools, quality mattered, and quality required time. This meant that making things was rarely rushed, even when there was pressure elsewhere. A hunt could wait a day. A blade made poorly could ruin weeks of effort. So people invested attention where it paid off most. They slowed down to go faster later. Stone was only one part of this world. Hide processing consumed enormous amounts of time. After an animal was killed, the work had only begun. Removing flesh, scraping membranes, drying, smoking, or treating hides to keep them flexible. This was chemistry without formulas, learned through experience. Use-wear studies on scrapers show long, repetitive motions consistent with hours of hide work. Ethnographic parallels confirm that processing a single hide could take an entire day or more, and hides were essential. Clothing, bedding, shelter, containers. Without them, cold and injury became far more dangerous. Bone and antler added another layer. Unlike stone, these materials were organic and unpredictable. They required different tools and techniques. Carving antler into points or handles took patience. Bone awls had to be shaped precisely. Too thin and they snapped. Too thick and they failed their purpose. Again, this work was not improvised. It followed learned patterns. Archaeologists see this in standardization. Across wide regions, tools share similar shapes and proportions. This suggests teaching, shared mental templates. People knew what a proper tool looked like. But within that standardization, individuality appears. Some blades are more symmetrical than necessary. Some handles are smoother than required. Some bone tools are decorated lightly, even when decoration adds nothing to function. This is where survival quietly gives way to expression. People were not just making tools that worked. They were making tools that looked right. This matters because it reveals motivation beyond necessity. No one spends extra time perfecting symmetry unless they care about the result. A perfectly balanced point does not hunt better than a slightly uneven one, but it communicates skill, attention, identity. Making things became a way of being known, and this making did not happen in isolation. Children watched constantly. There were no classrooms, but there was continuous education. A child sat nearby, mimicking movements with small stones. An older adult corrected hand position with a gesture. Learning happened through proximity, repetition, and patience. Mistakes were expected. Broken flakes litter archaeological sites for a reason. Learning produced waste. Groups tolerated this because teaching produced future skill. The cost of a broken flake was small compared to the value of a competent adult later. This is one reason why making things occupied the middle of the day. After food needs were met and before evening gatherings, daylight was ideal for detailed work. Light mattered. Seeing fracture lines mattered. Eye strain mattered. The sun provided steady illumination without artificial aid. So the day settled into a familiar rhythm. People sat, they worked, they talked, they rested between bursts of effort. The body leaned forward, then relaxed. Hands stayed busy even when minds wandered. This kind of work had a meditative quality. Anthropologists observing traditional craft production often note how repetitive hand movements calm the nervous system. Attention narrows gently. Time becomes less noticeable. This was not flow as a modern concept, but it was something close. Making things regulated emotion. In a world with real danger, this mattered. Craft provided control. Stone behaved according to rules. Hide responded predictably. Bone could be shaped with care. These materials offered feedback that the wider world did not always provide. And because making things was so central, it shaped social structure. People who made especially good tools gained influence. Not authority in a political sense, but respect. Others sought their advice. Their opinions carried weight. This created early forms of social differentiation, but without rigid hierarchy. No one was above the group. Skill elevated, but dependence balanced it. The best tool maker still needed food. The best hunter still needed hides. Interdependence prevented domination. Archaeological evidence supports this balance. We do not see extreme accumulation of wealth or tools in individual burials during much of the Paleolithic. Goods circulated, ownership was fluid. Value lay in knowledge more than objects. Objects broke, Knowledge endured. And because knowledge lived in people, not storage, teaching was constant. A good technique spread quickly. Innovations appeared slowly, then persisted for generations. Lithic traditions can be traced across thousands of years with subtle refinements rather than sudden revolutions. This tells us something important. Progress was incremental. There were no constant upgrades, no version numbers, no pressure to innovate for its own sake. Improvements were adopted when they worked better, not when they were novel. This conservatism was adaptive. A proven method was safer than an untested one. When survival was at stake, reliability beat creativity, and yet creativity still emerged. Decoration appears again and again. Incised lines on bone, polished surfaces, careful shaping beyond function. These choices took extra time that could have been spent doing something else, which means people had time to spare. And they chose to spend it making things nicer. That choice speaks volumes about daily life. It suggests that after food and safety were secured, humans turned their attention toward meaning, identity, and pride in workmanship. Making things was not just about survival, it was about belonging. When you carried a tool you made yourself, or that someone else made for you, it connected you to the group. It told a story. Who made this? How long it took? What skills it represents? Tools were not anonymous. They were social objects. This also explains why making things did not feel like drudgery. It was embedded in social life. People talked while working, joked, told stories, corrected each other gently. Silence and conversation coexisted easily. No one was isolated at a workstation. Work happened in clusters, in shared spaces, in daylight, surrounded by familiar sounds. This environment shaped psychology. It made effort tolerable, even pleasant. And because making things required care, it slowed the day naturally. There was no benefit to rushing. Precision mattered more than speed. The work itself enforced patience. By the time evening approached, much had been accomplished. Tools repaired, new ones made, hides progressing, bones shaped, supplies prepared, not in a frenzy, but steadily. And when the light softened, people stopped. Not because a clock said so, but because eyes tired and hands slowed. Work ended when it no longer felt wise to continue. This is the quiet center of the prehistoric day. Not hunting, not gathering, but the long, steady process of making the material world usable, reliable, and meaningful. It was here more than anywhere else that humans learned to shape their environment deliberately. One careful strike, one patient scrape, one improvement passed forward. Civilization did not begin with monuments or cities. It began with people sitting together in daylight, taking time to make things well, even when making them faster would have worked just fine. And once those things were made, once the world was set in order for the moment, attention was free to drift again, toward rest, toward play, toward conversation, toward the quieter hours of the evening, because when the center holds, everything else can soften around it. Once the necessary work was done and the tools were set aside, something unusual by modern standards quietly took over the day. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding, just time. And instead of rushing to fill it, early humans did something we've almost forgotten how to do. They let it exist. In a Paleolithic camp, free time was not a reward. It was not something you earned by finishing your tasks early or by outperforming others. It was simply what remained when survival needs had been met. And because those needs were limited, because the body itself set natural boundaries, large stretches of the day unfolded without instructions. Rest came first, and it came without apology. When your body was tired, you rested, not because you had burned out, but because muscles that don't recover become injuries, and injuries can be fatal in a world without doctors. Resting was not a moral failure. It was maintenance. Sitting under shade, lying on a bed of grasses, leaning against a warm rock while the afternoon light shifted slowly across the ground. No one counted minutes. No one watched a clock. The only question was whether your body felt ready to move again. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show this clearly. Periods of activity are followed by long intervals of low-intensity rest. People recline, they groom, they talk lazily, they stare. From a modern perspective, it might look like nothing is happening. From an evolutionary perspective, everything important is happening. While bodies rest, attention trains itself. Early humans spent extraordinary amounts of time simply watching clouds change shape and direction, watching animals move across the landscape at different hours, watching insects navigate the ground, watching how shadows lengthen and retreat. This was not idle curiosity. This was how you learned the world. In evolutionary psychology, this kind of observation is often described as attention training. When survival depends on subtle environmental cues, the brain learns to stay gently alert without being stressed. Not hyper-focused, not distracted, just open. A person who has spent hundreds of hours quietly observing will notice things others miss. A shift in bird behavior, a pattern in animal tracks, a change in wind that carries unfamiliar scents. In this context, doing nothing is actually learning without effort. And then there was social time. Conversation without agenda. In small bands of 20 to 40 people, social life is not optional background noise. It is the infrastructure that keeps everyone alive. People talked while resting, not loudly, not urgently. They talked about what they had seen, what they remembered, what they thought might happen tomorrow. Stories drifted. Jokes landed softly. Teasing happened, but rarely cruelly. In groups this small, cruelty has consequences. There were no interviews, no small talk. No one asked what you planned to do with your life. Your life was already happening, right there, visible to everyone. Evolutionary psychology tells us that these kinds of low-stakes conversations are essential for social bonding. They synchronize emotional states. They resolve small tensions before they grow dangerous. They reinforce shared memory. A group that talks together survives together. Silence was equally important. Modern humans often treat silence as something uncomfortable, something to be filled. Early humans did not. Silence was information. The absence of sound could be as meaningful as its presence. Sitting quietly allowed ears to stay tuned to the world beyond the camp. It also allowed the mind to wander. This wandering mind is not a flaw. It is a feature. When the brain is not occupied with tasks, it begins to integrate experiences. Patterns form, memories settle, solutions appear without effort. Many cognitive scientists believe that creativity, problem-solving, and long-term planning emerge most naturally during periods of mental rest. Early humans had plenty of those. Children played constantly. Play was not scheduled. It did not require equipment. It happened wherever there was space and energy. Children chased each other, wrestled through sticks, stacked stones, mimicked adult behaviors with exaggerated seriousness. A child pretending to hunt with a stick was not wasting time. They were rehearsing coordination, judgment, risk, and social negotiation. Play, in evolutionary terms, is how complex skills are learned safely. Adults often joined in, mock competitions, lighthearted challenges, teasing games that tested boundaries without real danger. Laughter mattered. A group that laughs together regulates stress together. No one called this development. It was just growing up. Grooming was another quiet center of free time. Sitting close, picking debris from hair, scratching backs, braiding hair, applying ochre or fat to skin. These actions served practical purposes: hygiene, parasite removal, protection from sun and insects. But they also served a deeper function. They communicated care. In primates, grooming is one of the strongest signals of social trust. Early humans continued this pattern. Touch reassured the nervous system. It reinforced belonging. In a dangerous world, knowing that someone would sit with you, touch you gently, tend to you, mattered as much as food. And then there was simply being present. Watching the fire, following sparks as they rose and vanished, tracing stars, noticing how the moon changed night by night. These moments were not framed as spiritual obligations or philosophical exercises. They were what happened when there was nothing else to do. Without artificial light, evenings naturally slowed. Activity contracted toward the fire. Voices softened. Movements became smaller. This rhythm aligned closely with human circadian biology. Sleep came easier when the day had unfolded at its own pace. Importantly, no one measured their worth by how busy they were. There was no concept of productivity as identity, no virtue in exhaustion, no admiration for constant effort. Contribution mattered, yes. Laziness that endangered the group would not be tolerated. But beyond that, there was no pressure to optimize existence. If you rested, you rested. If you played, you played. If you sat and watched clouds for an hour, no one intervened to ask if you were using your time wisely. From a modern perspective, this can feel unsettling. We are trained to believe that time must always be justified, that idleness is suspicious, that rest must be earned. Early humans lived inside a different logic. Time belonged to the group, the body, and the environment, not to abstraction. And this abundance of unstructured time shaped the human mind. It allowed language to grow richer, stories to stretch longer, humor to become subtle, attention to deepen, relationships to stabilize. A nervous system that evolved in this environment expects pauses. It expects variation. It expects days that breathe. When we deny it those things, it reacts. Anxiety, restlessness, burnout. These are not personal failures. They are biological signals that the rhythm is off. Early humans did not know they were practicing mental health. They were simply living in alignment with their conditions. Their free time was not empty. It was the space in which everything else made sense. So when we ask what they did with all that free time, the answer is deceptively simple. They rested, they watched, they talked, they played, they were quiet, they let their minds and bodies do what they had evolved to do when not under pressure. And in that quiet, they stayed human. Once the noise of work faded and the long stretches of unclaimed time settled in, something else quietly became visible. Not tools, not food, not fire, but people, and not crowds of them. Just enough to know every face, every voice, every habit, and every story that mattered. For most of human history, society was small enough to fit inside memory. A Paleolithic band usually consisted of somewhere between 20 and 40 people, rarely more than 50, rarely fewer than 15. This was not an accident, and it was not random. It was the result of biology, logistics, and emotional capacity aligning into a narrow, workable range. Modern researchers often point to what is called Dunbar's number, the idea that humans can maintain stable social relationships with roughly 150 people. But long before reaching that outer limit, something more intimate happens. Around 30 or so individuals, relationships stop being abstract. You don't just recognize faces, you remember patterns. You know who wakes early and who lingers by the fire. You know who jokes when nervous. You know who shares food generously and who needs to be reminded. In a group this small, anonymity does not exist. And without anonymity, society works very differently. There were no written laws, no courts, no police, no prisons, but there was something far more powerful: reputation. Every action was visible, every pattern was remembered, not formally, not recorded, but carried in stories, glances, pauses, and tone of voice. In a band where you sleep a few feet from the same people every night, behavior echoes. If someone consistently shared food, people noticed. If someone avoided effort, people noticed. If someone caused conflict and never repaired it, people noticed. And because survival depended on cooperation, these observations mattered. This is what anthropologists call a reputation-based society. Your social standing was not tied to wealth or titles, but to reliability. Could others count on you? Would you show up when needed? Would you share when things went badly? No one announced these judgments. There were no verdicts. Instead, they surfaced quietly. In who sat near whom, in who received help quickly, in who was listened to during discussions, in who was trusted with children, tools, or fire. And yes, gossip played a role. Gossip in small societies is not idle chatter. It is information flow. It spreads news of behavior. It warns. It corrects. It reinforces norms. And unlike modern social media, it cannot be muted, blocked, or ignored. If you acted selfishly, the story traveled. If you acted bravely, the story traveled. If you apologized and repaired harm, that story traveled too. Gossip was not always kind, but it was effective. Importantly, conflict did not disappear in small groups. Humans argue, they misunderstand, they compete. Jealousy exists. So does resentment. The difference was scale. In a band of 30, unresolved conflict is dangerous. You cannot simply avoid someone forever. You will share food, fire, shelter, and sleep space. So societies evolved ways to soften friction before it tore the group apart. This is where mediation came in. Older individuals, especially elders who had outlived several cycles of conflict, often acted as stabilizers, not judges, not authorities, but memory keepers. They remembered how similar disputes ended before. Who reconciled? Who held grudges? What damage was caused when reconciliation failed? When tensions rose, elders spoke slowly. They reframed events. They reminded people of shared history. They shifted the narrative from you versus me to us surviving another winter. This was not formal justice. It was emotional engineering. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that these mechanisms evolved because groups that failed to manage internal conflict simply did not last. Splintering reduced defense, reduced mating options, reduced food security. Reconciliation was not moral, it was practical. Children grew up immersed in this system. They were not raised by two parents alone. They were raised by everyone. This is known as cooperative breeding, a pattern where multiple adults contribute to child care. Anthropologically, this is one of the defining features of human societies. A child learned not just from their mother or father, but from aunts, uncles, grandparents, older siblings, and unrelated adults. Each adult provided different skills, patience levels, and forms of attention. This distributed care reduced risk. If one caregiver was injured or absent, others filled the gap. Emotionally, it did something else. It embedded the child into the group from the beginning. Belonging was not abstract. It was physical and constant. Because everyone knew every child, behavior mattered early. A child who shared was praised. A child who pushed too far was corrected gently. Lessons were reinforced across multiple relationships. Social learning happened continuously, not in structured lessons. And adults, too, were shaped by this closeness. In modern societies, it is possible to reinvent oneself endlessly, to move, to disappear, to escape reputation. In Paleolithic life, you carried your past with you every day. This encouraged consistency, not perfection, just predictability. A person could be grumpy, they could be awkward, they could even be difficult. But if they were reliable, the group adapted. If they were unreliable, the group remembered. Status existed, but it looked different. There were skilled tool makers, exceptional trackers, charismatic storytellers, patient teachers. People gained influence through competence and contribution, not domination. Physical strength mattered, but only alongside cooperation. A strong individual who disrupted group cohesion was a liability. Interestingly, humor played a role in regulation. Teasing was common. Light mockery corrected behavior without escalation. A joke could signal disapproval without confrontation. Songs sometimes carried subtle criticism. Laughter softened lessons. This mattered because in small societies, shame had to be managed carefully. Too much shame fractures belonging. Too little allows exploitation. Humor balanced the line. What emerges from all this is a society that feels intensely personal. Everyone mattered. Everyone was known. Everyone was remembered. From a neurological perspective, this aligns with how human brains evolved. Our stress systems are calibrated for small groups. Our empathy circuits respond best to familiar faces. Our sense of safety increases when social networks are stable and legible. Large anonymous societies require artificial structures to replace this. Laws, institutions, surveillance, metrics. Early humans needed none of these because memory and proximity did the work. But this intimacy came with trade-offs. Privacy was limited. Solitude existed, but not isolation. Your moods were noticed, your absences remarked upon. You could not disappear into silence for weeks without someone checking in. And yet, this constant visibility also meant constant support. Illness was noticed early. Grief was shared immediately. Fear was collective. No one suffered completely alone unless they chose to.
At night, when the fire drew everyone inward, these relationships condensed even further. Bodies close, voices low, stories reinforcing who belonged and why. Reputation was not frozen. It shifted, slowly, with behavior.
A mistake did not define you forever. Repair mattered. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden here. In a society small enough to remember everyone, identity is not a resume. It is a pattern over time, a rhythm of actions, a story that can change. Early humans did not build civilizations to escape this intimacy. They expanded beyond it because numbers grew. But something was lost along the way, not simplicity, but legibility. When everyone is known, life is quieter. Not easier, but clearer. And after spending the day resting, making, observing, and playing, it was this social fabric that held the evening together. Not rules, not schedules, just memory, attention, and the knowledge that tomorrow you would wake among the same faces again. Known, remembered, necessary. As the light began to lose its sharp edges and the air cooled just enough to be noticed, the day quietly changed its character. Nothing dramatic happened. No signal was given, but everyone felt it. This was the hour when effort loosened its grip and the world leaned inward. Evening for early humans was not the end of work. It was the point where work stopped being separate from being together. The evening meal sat at the center of this shift, not because it was the largest meal of the day in every environment, though often it was, but because it gathered everyone in one place. Throughout the day, people ate as they went, a handful of berries here, a roasted root pulled from ashes there, maybe marrow cracked open and shared quickly. But evening was when food slowed down and became social. People sat close to the fire, not in neat rows, not in assigned places, but in familiar patterns shaped by habit and comfort. Children drifted between adults, elders took positions where they could see everyone. Someone tended the fire while others prepared food with unhurried movements. Sharing mattered here. Who offered the first portion? Who passed food without being asked? Who noticed a child reaching from the edge of the circle? These small acts were not recorded, but they were remembered. Evening meals were quiet evaluations, not judgmental, just observant. In societies without written rules, behavior at the fire mattered more than speeches ever could. Food distribution reinforced social bonds, not through fairness as an abstract principle, but through attentiveness. A person who had eaten less earlier might be offered more now. Someone injured that day might be served first. Children were rarely last. Nobody announced these decisions. They emerged naturally from familiarity. As people ate, conversation shifted tone. Daytime talk was practical, short, functional, shouted across distance if needed. Evening talk slowed, voices lowered, sentences stretched. Laughter came easier. This was the time when stories appeared. Not grand myths, not sacred narratives, just stories. Someone talked about a hunt that nearly worked and why it failed. Someone else remembered a gathering trip where they misidentified a plant and paid for it later. These stories were not performances. They were lessons disguised as memory. A good story did not need a dramatic ending. It only needed to be useful. Stories served as the group's long-term memory. In the absence of writing, repetition mattered. A story told once might be forgotten. A story told over several evenings became durable. Details sharpened. Patterns emerged. Younger listeners learned without realizing they were being taught. Importantly,
Stories did not need to be completed in one night. If a story was interrupted by sleep, it simply resumed later. No one demanded a resolution. No one complained about pacing. Time was patient. This is one of the most striking differences between prehistoric evenings and modern ones. There was no pressure to entertain, no obligation to be interesting. Silence was allowed to sit between words. Sometimes the fire itself became the focus. People stared into it, not passively but attentively. The flicker of flames draws the human brain into a relaxed but alert state. Modern neuroscience shows that watching fire lowers blood pressure and calms the nervous system. Early humans did not need studies to know this. They felt it every night. As bodies relaxed, behavior softened. Arguments from earlier in the day lost their sharpness. A tense moment was sometimes revisited, but gently. Someone joked, someone apologized without ceremony. Repair happened quietly. This was not conflict avoidance. It was timing. Humans are more capable of empathy when fed, warm, and safe. Children slowed down too. After a day of constant motion, they leaned against familiar bodies. Heads rested on shoulders. Eyes followed sparks drifting upward. They listened, half engaged, absorbing rhythms and voices more than content. Learning continued, but without effort. An elder might casually mention a sign of weather noticed years ago. A parent pointed out how shadows had shifted since morning. Knowledge slipped into conversation without becoming instruction. And then there were moments when no one spoke. These silences were not awkward. They were shared. Breathing synced. Someone adjusted the fire. Someone else added a log. The circle held. From an evolutionary perspective, this mattered deeply. Evening gatherings reinforced trust. They allowed the nervous systems of the group to settle together. A calm group slept better. A group that slept well survived better. Sleep, after all, was coming. But before sleep, there was one more quiet function of the evening. Reflection. Not self-analysis, not regret. Just awareness. People noticed who was missing, who was quiet, who seemed unsettled. These observations guided behavior the next day. Someone might be checked on. Help might be offered without explanation, and nothing was written down. Nothing was formalized. But nothing was ignored. As the fire burned lower, the day did not end sharply. It softened. Activity narrowed. People shifted closer together. The world beyond the fire faded into suggestion. The evening did not demand productivity. It did not ask for conclusions. It allowed the day to dissolve slowly into rest. And in that gentle unwinding, early humans found something we often struggle to reclaim. An ending that did not feel rushed. A pause that belonged to everyone. A sense that nothing urgent remained unfinished. Tomorrow would come. Work would return. But for now, the day was allowed to settle, not with noise, but with warmth, stories, and the quiet knowledge that everyone was still there, together. By the end of an ordinary day, long before clocks, nothing about early human life would have looked easy. Bodies were tired, hands were worn, hunger was never completely forgotten, and yet, what stands out is not how hard life was, but how rarely it was rushed. Early humans were not idle. They walked miles. They carried weight. They made everything they owned by hand. But their days were not compressed. Effort came in pulses, followed by long stretches of quiet. Work ended when it was enough, not when it was maximized.
They owned very little, but time was abundant. Not time measured or planned or saved, but time felt. Time that widened when nothing urgent pressed against it. Time that allowed attention to wander, conversations to drift, stories to stretch over many evenings without needing to arrive anywhere. They did not optimize life. They lived inside it. Modern progress has given us comfort, speed, and scale. It has shortened distances and extended lifespans, but it has also tightened time. Our days are fuller, louder, more efficient, and yet many of us feel strangely behind, as if we are always arriving late to our own lives. The people we've been walking with tonight did not know about productivity or burnout. They did not track hours or measure output. Their sense of a good day was simpler. Were people fed? Was the group safe? Did the fire hold? Did the night arrive gently? When those conditions were met, the day was allowed to end. Perhaps the lesson they leave us is not about returning to the past. We cannot, and maybe we shouldn't want to. But we can remember something quieter. That a human day does not need to be full to be meaningful. That rest is not a reward. That attention is a form of care. That being together without an agenda is not wasted time. And maybe what we call progress is not always movement forward, but sometimes a new way of forgetting an older rhythm that still lives in our bodies. So, as this story fades and your own evening softens, you don't need to do anything with it. You don't need to remember every detail. Just let it sit, like a fire that has done its work, like a day that has been enough. For now, the world can wait until morning.